Hello, beautiful people. Welcome to this week's episode of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. I'm your host, Olga Peters, and this is the show where we talk about how everything in Montpelier shakes out for the rest of us. I want to welcome regular contributor Emily Coyne-Heiser, who's one of three reps from Brattleboro. Hello, Emily.
Hi, Olga. So nice to see you.
It's good to see you too. And very happy to see, because I haven't seen you in a long time, Leslie Goldman, who is a rep from Rockingham, right around the corner. So thank you for joining us today, Leslie.
It's my pleasure.
And we're going to be discussing some laws today that have to do with protecting abortion access and gender affirming care and the clinicians who provide them. But before we dive into the laws, I just want to have a quick little civics lesson, because there's two companion laws that are moving through the House right now. One is H89 and one is S37, and they're similar but not exactly alike. So I would love, Emily, would you just take a minute for our impromptu civics lessons, please?
Sure. So H89 started in the House. We know it started in the House because it starts with an H. And that one focused on the legal side of sort of shield laws. And sort of shield laws are designed to protect the people engaged in them from other action. And so that was sort of the legal side of it. And then the Senate bill, the S one that we're talking about, and I think we actually talked about that one when earlier in the year. And then this other one, the Senate bill, is focused on protecting providers from sort of the world of medical stuff like malpractice, et cetera, and has some, we'll get into it, but has some really interesting pieces around pharmacists and protecting pharmacists. And so that's sort of the division. Last week, when we were talking about housing, we talked about how hard it is when a bill has multiple jurisdictions. Do you remember that conversation, Olga?
Yes, I do. Yep.
And so it could have been, so that bill that we talked about last week, which has nothing to do with shield laws, had to make a stop in multiple committees because it covered multiple jurisdictions, even though they were all sort of toward the same policy end.
Right.
There was a different choice made with these two bills in that it's two bills with a very similar policy end, but one spent most of its time in the Judiciary Committee. That's the one that is the H bill. And one spent most of its time in the Healthcare Committee. That's the S bill. And so rather than having the two of them together in an omnibus bill, they've had sort of, it's been two bills that moved separately and just visited the other committee, but spent most of its time. And so that's sort of like another, yes. Yeah. It's like another calendar math legislative strategy way to get stuff done.
Very appreciative. Thank you for our impromptu civics lesson, Emily. Leslie, you serve on the House Healthcare Committee, and you have a background in healthcare yourself. And when we were talking earlier on the phone, you talked about how important S37 is to you. And Emily mentioned that you gave a really amazing kind of introduction to the bill on the floor that really resonated with her. And I'm wondering, would you, just for the sake of listeners, would you mind sharing some of those thoughts with us again?
Well, my floor report started really with my life story. I was 20 when Roe came down from the Supreme Court, and my entire adult life, Roe has been the law of the land. And then last summer, and I'm getting tearful, the Supreme Court overruled Roe and sent it back to the states. And we see how that's turned out. We have many different states taking different actions. I don't understand, and that's why I get tearful, why politicians feel the need to interfere in this. I really think it should be between a woman or a person and her family and a clinician, and it's not political. It should not be. I'm proud to be in Vermont. We passed our constitutional amendment to protect our rights for reproductive liberty. So these laws come out of that belief that we in Vermont should take care of ourselves where they should be taken care of between ourselves and in our clinicians' offices. So that's sort of the driving factor. I've been a family nurse practitioner for 37 years. I actually worked in an offsite birthing center, so I've had that kind of experience when I was in nursing school. So I've sort of been around the block in that world. And as a clinician, it meant a lot to me to be able to report on this bill, protecting clinicians from doing what they thought was the right thing for women and for gender affirming care as well. So the bill covers both. And I think both of those responsibilities do not land with politicians.
Thank you, Leslie. Yes. Yeah, I think we can all agree on that, at least the three of us here.
Yeah.
Um,
Many more of us, I will say.
Yeah, I mean, and you know, continued reminder that the Reproductive Liberty Amendment passed in every single town in this state. And I think that's really meaningful about what it says about Vermont, like really across the Vermonters across the political spectrum.
Yeah.
And
Well,
I will
and I
also
think,
say,
oh no, go ahead, Leslie, please.
yeah, just to add to that, S37 passed through the House on a roll call vote of 115 to 17. So that was clearly tripartisan.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think, I believe it's Emily has said a few times when we've been having conversations around healthcare access, especially around abortions, but also gender affirming care, how I think the word you used was now I'm forgetting it, precedent.
Have you
Kind of looking forward and making protections prescient. Thank you.
Prescient. Yes. And it's really talking about the work that Jill Kruwinski and Becca Ballant did when they were majority leaders, really started this ball rolling back when we weren't quite sure that the Supreme Court would get this bad. But certainly could see the writing on the wall in terms of states and what states are doing.
You could see the slow train wreck.
Yes.
Yes, from the distance.
Or at least, you know, they could, which is remarkable because they're both really very optimistic people, like overly optimistic.
Probably some of the most optimistic people in the state.
I think that maybe that's what you need to survive in this work to some degree. So in addition to the protections for healthcare providers, there's some sort of like little details of it that might not, that sort of are shield law adjacent that might be worth naming before we dive in. So there's the protections around gender affirming care and around access to abortions, et cetera. But there's also a few other little pieces. So there's been sort of a long-term conversation in Vermont, in the Vermont legislature, around pregnancy centers.
Yes.
And what to do about those and the misinformation in them. And, you know, there are 2 in Brattleboro now.
I didn't know.
Yeah, I didn't realize there was now a second one.
The Reformer had a cover article interviewing the director of a new one that is on Putney Road.
Okay.
In that weird orange building in front of the marina.
Okay.
And then there's, you know, one on Bird Street next to the live water church. I don't remember the church's name.
Right.
River, whatever.
Riverview or River something.
So that's huge because consumer protection laws don't apply if you're doing something for free.
Right.
And so that was a really nice expansion of, I think that was, it was an impressive bit of legal sort of work.
Well,
to really
I found that section on emergency birth services interesting too, where there was a lot of definition about why someone what would characterize it in a consumer's eye as medical, which was something I think most of us, if you read it, would be like, yeah, if someone's dressed in scrubs and there's an exam table, this is a medical place, but that may not be the case for something that's volunteer.
And I'd love to like get more into that with Leslie in a second. And then the other piece, which it was sort of brand new, and speak about, you know, the legislature rarely is capable of acting this fast, so I'm very impressed and pleased, is a piece about enabling prescribers and folks who are filling prescriptions. So a lot of licensing pieces are wrapped up in pharmacists to prescribe or fill prescriptions for medicine that was FDA approved as of a certain date. Which I thought was another sort of like very narrow and clear way of of getting something done. And so that's also incredibly exciting that we were able to do that as well. The debate around the bill was really wild and sad and terrible. And we can talk about that after Leslie tells us more about the actual bill.
I'd like to comment on the pregnancy centers. When we were sitting in our committee, we had testimony from representatives of those centers, but also the Attorney General, Assistant Attorney General, and an ethics, someone the head of the ethics network. It was really good. So the person, and also a person from the center, I think I said, a bunch of us went to that website as they were speaking, and we were able to look at their website and see that it did present itself as a medical facility, that it did fit those criteria as we were sitting there. And it was frustrating and disheartening that some of the members of the committee just couldn't get their heads beyond the fact that these were not legitimate places. They were continuing to be committed that they were doing good work and that they were not misrepresenting themselves. And it was hard. It was very hard to listen to. There was another piece that pregnancy centers do is that they continue to hammer on the idea that there's a medicine out there to interrupt a medical abortion and that medicine needs to be available. And there's nothing, there's no data, there's no studies, there's nothing, no FDA approval, no nothing to support that idea. And yet they hammered on it and hammered on it and hammered on it and really wanted us to include that. And it was really hard. The whole thing was very difficult to be sitting sort of next to someone whose views of women are so diametrically opposed and, autonomy. And I think it's really important to understand sort of what legally protected healthcare activity is, because that's a new definition that was put in the bill. And that applied then in so many different places, both with gender affirming care, especially with gender affirming care and with termination of pregnancy. So that as long as it's a legally protected healthcare activity in Vermont, then Vermont healthcare providers are protected. Their licenses are protected in Vermont. And that's crucial. Yeah. What's difficult, I'll just continue with the difficulty because you're hearing now the conversation in the committee. If someone, and we're thinking a lot about telehealth because that's how most providers are going to be doing out of state care. Let's say your plane is flying and you have an emergency landing in Texas, can they come arrest you? Well, these are difficult and upsetting questions, which we could not resolve, obviously. But what we could do was protect clinicians in Vermont who are practicing legally in Vermont. Yeah.
Thank you, Leslie. Emily, you had a question?
So one thing that I think is really, well, on the pregnancy centers, I guess I'll say I have a constituent who has testified a lot in the context of the constitutional amendment and in the context of abortion rights generally. And the detail of her story is actually that she did go to she knew she was pregnant. She was looking for help quite young and wound up at a pregnancy center that she thought was a legitimate medical facility. And the details of her story and what that was like for her are really incredibly upsetting. The conversation around a medicine that reverses abortions laid itself out on the floor in a pretty wild way. And I think is really interesting in a number of really upsetting. It really magnified a number of pieces of both this debate, where we are in American politics right now, and even where we're heading in the Vermont legislature right now, that I think is worth diving into. So one aspect of the debate and the questions about this abortion reversal drug, or even about the sort of protection of the FDA approved drug, was that there were a number of legislators who were asking questions that, from my perspective, in debate on the floor, I was like, the fact that someone could live, 60 years, 80 years, and not actually understand how any of these things work because they have led a life that sheltered them from understanding how these things work. And then felt so emboldened as to then think that they could preside over those issues, right? Like, that was horrifying to me. I was just like, it was the curiosity that was actually making me more angry than anything else, that someone could, be so separated from the realities of women's reproductive lives, that they would be able to not know that, medical abortion was an incredibly normal and normalized procedure right now, and that there was like a war waging all over the country to make sure that women had access to it, and that like this is a huge part of sort of international reproductive rights, and just like all of it, that someone didn't have any of that context was horrifying to me. But then the piece about the reversal is upsetting, one, because like, again, well, there's definitely not like a drug that synthesizes human flesh or reconstitutes human flesh. So we like can know that you can't reverse an abortion, right? And so the fact that like in the face of that, and in the face of like all of this very clear medical evidence to the contrary, and the fact that Lori Houghton, as she was reporting the bill, said over and over again, like, there's no, and as Leslie just said, there's no clinical evidence for this whatsoever. The fact that that continued to be a reality on the floor of the House as a thing worth debating, and that Lori was sort of at some point left saying, it's just not a thing, right? And there have been just one or two other times in our legislative work that I've seen a reporter of a bill be sort of pushed up against a wall to the point where they were just like had to say like, it's just not a thing, like it's just not real, like it's not, and like how far it's to debate an imaginary idea and say it's imaginary is practically impossible within the rules of civility that we have. And I've seen more and more instances just in this last month in the Vermont legislature where in the context of debate, people are just saying things that aren't true rather than things that sort of, what they think the impacts of something might be, or why they don't agree with an idea, or all of that. They're just saying things that are just patently untrue. And that we, of course, know is happening all over the country, but it's kind of new to our legislative work, and it's scary.
Leslie, are you seeing that as well?
Yeah, for sure. I just want to echo what Emily was saying. I think that the way we phrased it in our committee amongst some of us who were struggling was the absolute lack of critical thinking. And that people were just not open. They just couldn't even question their own thinking when presented with evidence, very clear evidence to the contrary. And, the gentleman sitting next to me just basically said, I'm always going to believe that the pregnancy can be interrupted by a medicine, even though there was no evidence. And he just says, I'm going to believe it, period. And that is a very sad thing. Yeah.
Yeah, how do you even respond to that short of like, yeah, getting the smack up the side of the head, hello. Yeah.
Well, no, because he's big and loud and deep. Yeah, no. See, that's the thing, the male voice, like, Emily just said, who, many men observe women's, reproductive lives from beginning to end with caring and love. And if you love a woman, how could you not observe it, But this particular gentleman just had his own view, and that was that. And I know he has 13 grandchildren, and I know some of them must be female. So what the hell? I don't get it.
And it's, it was not, that's what happened, Leslie, in your committee, but on the floor, it was many more people who are sort of joining this very confused conversation. And I remember in the context of H57, sort of the first big abortion protection bill we passed, there was sort of a similar debate around what anti-abortion activists call partial birth abortions. And again, it was all that was available is to just say like, not a thing. It's just not a thing. It's imaginary. And that is like not, that's a hard thing to be saying on the floor, to just say like, not a thing. It's not real. Not real.
You know, as a clinician, you know, to say partial birth abortion or horrific things, oh, the baby's due tomorrow, but we're going to kill it today, that there are people who are practicing medicine who would even contemplate such an act when people take, you know, the Hippocratic Oath and work with people and their lives. It's just wrong. And I don't get it. And I don't get the motivation at all. But it's very interesting. I mean, Emily said early on that every town passed Article 22, thankfully, some closer than others. But in one town, when there was a huge proponent to vote against it, in that town, 70% voted for that individual and 70% voted for Article 22. How do you reconcile that? It's mind-boggling. Yeah.
Yeah, that is something that's some math to wrap your head around of what's going through people's minds. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I just want to quickly come back to emergency pregnancy centers and be explicit, because I'm not sure we were explicit enough with listeners, that one of the concerns about the misinformation that some of these centers put out is that it can muddle the waters to the point that it reduces the amount of time that a woman has to make decisions, and it may actually derail her from accessing the right health care for her.
And I want to be careful that, like, especially given that we're talking about gender affirming care here too, but just generally that, you know, people of various genders are able to get pregnant and get abortion. So I want to make sure that we
Yep.
as much as possible.
Thank you for that reminder.
Yeah, I will also comment on the pregnancy centers that they don't necessarily have qualified people doing the work. I mean, they're doing ultrasounds and trying to date pregnancies with people who are not necessarily licensed. When we were in the committee talking about this, we asked this person, so where's your medical director? Definitely off-site. And what's the credentials? A naturopath who doesn't necessarily have those kind of credentials. So there's just a lot of misinformation, and I might even say deception, that this law is beginning to address. The problem that came up, and Emily, I don't know about the individual that you were in contact with, is they kept saying, but there have been no complaints. So we're fine. There have been no complaints. So a lot of times things that come to the Attorney General are complaint driven. And, you know, the question becomes, are there complaints? And they say no, so we're all fine. And I think that needs to change. The law does say that now the Attorney General does have consumer protections for free service, and that's huge, but it has to go the next step. There has to be complaints too.
Meaning consumers need to file complaints?
Yeah, and I think the vast majority, I mean, I've certainly had a lot of, you know, gnarly consumer experiences in my life, as I'm sure everyone has here in, you know, 2023 capitalism. But I have never called the Consumer Protection Office at the Attorney General's office to complain about anything. And I am a person who knows it exists because I work with them. And I know it exists because I actually went to grad school in the same building it's housed in, and it's not a very big building. And so some of my graduate school colleagues worked there. So I've known about it for a very long time, and I've still never called. So the idea that like we somehow know that nefarious things are happening only because consumers like actually take the time to call that office is just wild nonsense.
Nonsense. That's the real problem. And they're using that to bolster their existence. So, but why would we expect a young woman who's just, you know, in the middle of a crisis, then go and who got bad information, then go right, you know, it's really asking too much, I think, in that situation. So I think there needs to be another pathway or something. Yeah.
Thank you. We are just about out of time. Before we move on to break to hear from some of our underwriters, at this point in the conversation, what's important to leave listeners with?
I would say that in Vermont, we are safe in providing medical abortions. We have that capacity and stockpile. We in Vermont have legally protected care, both for gender affirming and reproduction, and that we are going to protect our clinicians who want to do both those services, who are brave, I think, and want to, in this sort of environment, want to provide those services in other states. And we're protecting our clinicians. Yeah.
Thank you. And just to be clear, Leslie, when we talk about protecting clinicians, because there's multiple laws in place ensuring abortion care and gender affirming care, it's not so much protecting clinicians from forces within Vermont. It's more concerns around telemedicine and working with people outside the state lines. Is that clear?
Yeah, it's about being subpoenaed from other states. That's not legit. That won't be legal in Vermont. We don't have to provide that kind of information if someone is providing that care. It's protecting insurance. So if that care is being provided by a clinician, either reproductive or gender affirming care, they cannot raise insurance malpractice rates, that kind of stuff.
Thank you. Emily, any last thoughts before we go to break?
I'm continue to be really proud to live in a state where we are protecting folks from to get what they need, so that each of us here has the energy to live a little bit with a little bit less fear. So maybe we can go out and help other people.
Thank you. Stay tuned. The Montpelier Happy Hour on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro will return in a moment. Welcome back to the second half of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. I'm your host, Olga Peters, and I'm speaking with Representative Leslie Goldman, as well as Representative Emily Kornheiser. And before we dive back into our conversations around S37, I want to remind listeners that you can find the Happy Hour on the radio station at Fridays on 2 p.m. at 2 p.m., as well as Wednesdays, a rebroadcast at 8 a.m. You can also find us on many of the PEG stations around Vermont, thanks to BCTV, as well as wherever you subscribe to podcasts. And Emily, what else do we want to remind listeners of?
The views and opinions expressed here on the Montpelier Happy Hour are those of the host and the guests, respectively, and not the station nor their employers, or friends or family.
Thank you. So if you're just joining us, we are talking about S37, which is a bill that the House voted on last week, affirmed last week, and it deals with shield laws to protect clinicians who are providing abortion care and or gender affirming care. And I would love, I don't remember if it was Leslie or Emily during the break who said this to me, in the first half of the show, we talked a lot about issues around abortions and access to care. And I said, I'd like to dive into the gender affirming care portions of this bill, to which one of you, I think it was Leslie, said, well, you don't really see them as separate portions of the bill. And so I'd love if you would repeat that for listeners.
Yeah, I think I said that. And, in Vermont, we actually added a new definition. It's called legally protected healthcare activity. And I'll just read it quickly. It's the exercise and enjoyment or attempted exercise and enjoyment of any person of rights to reproductive healthcare services or gender affirming care secured by the state. So we are putting in statute that clinicians who are practicing evidence-based medicine within their scope of practice, based on their license, are practicing legitimate healthcare, and they are doing what they should be doing. The issue around gender affirming care, I think, adds a little bit of a different sort of aspect in that some of that may be by telehealth. Because let's say you start gender affirming care in Vermont and then you go to college. Gender affirming care is there's a team that supports youth and their family in going through that process. So if a youth starts the process in Vermont, but then goes to college elsewhere, but they still want to have contact with their team, they can do that through telehealth and they're protected. Because currently the law is that you have to follow the laws of the state where the patient is. So that's been the problem. If the patient's in Texas, then you have to follow Texas law. What we're saying now is that we are going to protect both from criminal and disciplinary action providers in Vermont who are practicing in other states. So
Thank you.
that's the real huge value of this. Yeah.
I have a, can I share? Go ahead.
Just, I want to say one thing I appreciate about that is not only does it protect a patient's access to care, but if you have started care, you know, the continuity of care is also very important in the world of taking care of ourselves. And so I appreciate that if someone has started working with a team that is working for them, that they can continue that care regardless of where they are. I think that's a really important piece.
Yeah.
Sorry, Emily. I interrupted you.
Oh, go ahead, Leslie.
I think there was a lot of concern in the discussion about this in our committee about who's involved in making these decisions and consent. We spent a lot of time talking about consent law, and I have here in my pile something about consent. The point being that minors may not, that the only thing that minors can consent to without parental involvement is counseling. And that's fine, but because gender affirming care is a long process that involves counseling, they may not start medication without parental consent until they're over 18. And that's just the way it is. There was a lot of concern in the committee about parental involvement, and the law is pretty clear on what consent means for youth and made sense. And we just want to follow the law.
Thank you. Emily.
Leslie has one more thing.
This is sort of in the other topic, but in terms of reproductive care, youth under 18 can give consent for their own care without parental involvement. And that's an important distinction. Thank you.
Thank you.
So there are a few pieces of this that I think are interesting sort of background context. One is what we're seeing in other states is a real slippery slope where sort of a small group is targeted for something, and then that sort of trickles into other areas of care. And so, you know, in Vermont, the first sort of toehold or assault on rights of trans folks or gender queer folks is, you know, last year when we passed the trans panic defense, that was actually like fairly hard to get passed. And I'm really grateful to Representative Taylor Small, who, you know, really was very transparent about her own identity and was able to, you know, testify under some really, really harsh conditions in the Senate in order to get this across the finish line. I think that having Taylor in the House and really helped the debate on the House floor. And we really spent no time actually on the gender affirming care part of this legislation on the House floor in terms of debate. And I think, you know, it does, representation really, really matters. It really matters. And I think that's part of that. And I just don't want to, as so many other debates play out about the makeup of the legislature and about the bills that we pass, I think that's a really important shining light to remember. Also, you know, I think these conversations have mostly started in other states, first in the context of sports. And they're really, you know, they're funny in the context of sports, right? Like the conversation around a marathon and physiology is different than the conversation around cultural conditioning and chess, but both are, you know, historically have been separated by gender. We just saw a Vermonter win the Boston Marathon in the genderqueer category, and that's really, or non-binary category, I guess they called it. It's really exciting. And in other states, the sort of first bill that passed on the anti-trans agenda was about sports. And there is a bill that was introduced that's on the wall in the House Education Committee that I've seen a lot of folks feel really, I've talked to a number of UVM students and who feel really concerned about it. And so just want to like state, sort of clearly for our listeners that that bill is staying on the wall and no one's going to pick it up. Anyone can introduce anything, but it takes a huge amount of effort to get a bill passed. And that is not something that anyone has any interest in getting passed here. Certainly not the majority has an interest in getting passed here. So I hope that's slightly heartening. The other piece in terms of the toeholds is that when we see like the impact of these laws that prohibit people from accessing the care that they need often plays out in ways that perhaps like, I don't know if I want to call them unintended consequences, because they really seem just about like controlling the bodies of folks who aren't in power. So I don't know if it's an unintended consequence, but if I don't know how many folks have like sort of read about these drag queen bannings, right? And you ban drag queens and like, how do you even define what a drag queen is? Like, you wind up like kicking priests out because they wear dresses. And fancy
Oh, I never thought of that. That's cool.
I didn't think of it as just like a bad internet meme that I am now explaining to you if it is a meaningful thought. But another piece of it is gender affirming care. What does that mean? So, when someone is going through menopause and they take hormone supplements, that's, the same family of medicine that someone who is, wanting to appear in a different, gender would take. And that's gender affirming care too, right? It's affirming that like you want your body to work the way you feel your body should work as a woman, right? Or as a man. And like people take hormones as their bodies age in order to do that. And that's gender affirming care. So all of these things I think feel so cut and dry when people are like righteousing about them. But when you get into the nitty gritty, they're actually much more nuanced. And that is exactly why we leave them to decisions between healthcare professionals and the people who are getting that healthcare, because these issues are incredibly complex and meaningful to the lives of the people who are living them.
Yeah.
I just don't think that the people like that you're describing, Emily, can't see nuance. It's too hard. The complexity of thinking is just not there. And it's really about civil rights. When you distill it down, is who gets to decide, and it's not politicians. Don't take away civil rights. Just doesn't make any sense at all to me.
Thank you. Going back to S37 itself, a couple of other parts that I appreciated were being very explicit about, especially around gender affirming care, that someone's healthcare premiums can't be charged more for, their healthcare premiums. Leslie, would you dive into that a little bit?
Well, let me see if I can find that quickly.
Well, and while Leslie's looking for that, I'll say why it was, why it stood out to me is, for one, it symbolized to me how much thought had gone into this bill, like really looking at all the aspects of someone's life and how people might be getting charged more for care. And I thought that was really important.
I think it's the it was a huge deal when pre-existing condition protections passed in the Affordable Care Act, right? And how transformative that was for people's lives.
Yeah.
And on some level, all of these things are pre-existing conditions, right? And so it's like, it's a pre-existing condition to live in the body that you're born in and to experience the costs and the treatments that are part of that. And so I think that's, I'm really.
Yeah, I found it. I think what's interesting to know is that Blue Cross Blue Shield has been covering gender affirming care since 2012. Medicaid's been covering since 2015. So there's nothing that's going to be changing in their practices, which is really, I think, a good thing. What's changed is that health insurance plan shall not impose greater co-insurance, co-payment, deductible, or requirements for coverage of gender affirming care services. So they can't impose greater co-insurances or anything for that kind of care. And that was what was important. That was what was put into this bill.
Now, this does bring us, you mentioned Medicare, and of course, Blue Cross Blue Shield is a health insurance company that covers more than just Vermont. I think it brings us back to that issue of Vermont is not an island. And are there any concerns we need to be aware of around if the feds make certain decisions, or do we need to get any waivers from Medicaid, Medicare going forward? Like, how is this bill likely to interact with federal decision making? Does that make sense?
Yeah, but I haven't heard of any connection. I think the big issue is going to be the prostaglandin medications that will be medication abortions. If at the federal level it becomes not legal, then that will affect all of us in every state. But as long as there's no action on it, we're going to do in our state what's appropriate. Medicaid in this, I think, instance is pretty distinct from Medicare. Medicare is the elderly with the E at the end, so that is a helpful. Blue Cross Blue Shield actually is a nonprofit that I think, even though part of a bigger system, has its own set of rules and lives by those rules. We see.
So Vermont Blue Cross Blue Shield is a different organization than other Blue Cross Blue
That's
Shield.
right. That's right. So they're very distinct. We hear a lot from them, and we hear a lot, and you know, I think that they're doing the right thing, and they were very clear and care about it, and are going to be reliable partners in both gender affirming care and reproductive health care.
And we have a very, very carefully negotiated waiver on our Medicaid dollars to be using them really very much sort of as we see fit in most ways. And so that really helps there.
I think so. I would say, though, if I may, in terms of federal law, there is federal law that allows large insurers to self-insure, and we don't have any access to that. So that's a group of people in Vermont, and I don't remember off the top, it may be like 30%, somewhere around there. We don't have access to their insurance products.
Okay. Well,
yeah, I'll just say it's up to the employer. If the employer chooses to include that as part of their plan, then they have it. And they usually work with people like Blue Cross, but we don't know that. It's all proprietary. We don't have access.
And sort of a fairly famous example of a situation like that is Hobby Lobby and their insurance. I don't know I'm sure there are many other private insurers who operate that way, but that's sort of the one that's gotten the most press.
Well, I appreciate that. I think when Leslie and I were talking previously, you know, as someone who sat in on the Vermont Entergy versus Vermont court case, and hearing the supremacy clause like hammered over and over again, that's always in the back of my mind. Like, when Vermont makes decisions that might extend beyond its borders, what does that mean, since we are not an island as much as we kind of want to be sometimes?
Yeah, and as Olga and I were talking, we were saying that federal law always supersedes.
There you go.
Supersedes a Vermont law, trying to not use that word. So yeah, we are. That's our responsibility. That's our. I don't know what the right word is, but federal law is what rules.
Right. But right now, it doesn't look like there's anything that's going to bump up against S37. Okay, thank you.
Unless some judge decides to do something.
But, you know, even if, you know, we put in that language around the abortion pills, so that if, you know, it does become not approved by the FDA anymore, we would still have a right to prescribe it here. It becomes another question of then how it gets paid for, which is subject to a set of rules, right? And you know, the legislature put in place quite a number of years ago the beginnings of negotiating an importation program with Canada, which would give us sort of future access to the drug if the Scott administration is able to finish following through on that.
The shelf life of both those drugs, misoprostol and mifepristone, is about 2 years. And we apparently have enough of a stockpile to meet what is perceived to be the need in Vermont for that period of time. So that's a start. It's not perfect by any means. I have to say, as part of the process, as being part, watching this bill unfold, that this last piece of protecting the ability to dispense and prescribe these drugs, we put an amendment at the very last minute on the bill. And this particular part says reproductive healthcare services. So it changes the definition, includes medication that was approved by the FDA for termination of pregnancy as of January 1, 2023, regardless of the medication's current FDA approval status. So it really protects us in Vermont for keeping these drugs available. And that was amazing to watch that unfold. Yeah. And that came from the medical community. They really want to do the right thing. They want to treat women with the way that they feel they should be treated, and also to be protected in doing that treatment. It was great. Yeah.
Thank you. So when you, both of you, this question for both of you, when you think back to all the conversations that happened around S37, this bill, what for you, I guess in some ways I see S37 as responding to a lot of things that are unfolding in real time. And Emily mentioned earlier, quite rightly, sometimes legislatures can't respond that quickly to things that are unfolding in real time. So for you, either of you, were there any aha moments or anything you learned, anything you might bring forward, like a process you might bring forward to future lawmaking that, yeah.
I have a big one. So given that we needed to move really quickly on this, right? On pieces of this, the process often for the administration cooperating with the legislature is fairly tortured. And individual members of the administration are not permitted to talk to members of the legislature essentially without approval of what they're going to say. And sometimes that can take a really long time to get. And sometimes you just want a question answered about how things work. You're not looking for a position. I very rarely want the administration's position on something. I'm happy to wait a week to get the official position. Sometimes I just want to know how something actually functions or how someone does their job. And sometimes that requires a wait. And the Secretary of State's office is where professional regulations sits. And that is an independently elected office, not under the administration's thumb. And so it meant that a lot more back and forth and problem solving could happen really, really quickly. And a lot more sort of collaborative, congenial relationships could happen. And that makes a really big difference for passing good laws. And I think we've talked about this with John Walters a little bit. But the balance between maintaining those kinds of good relationships in order to know what you need to know in order to pass laws in a timely fashion and holding government offices accountable in the context of the larger administration is really challenging sometimes. Mm-hmm. And I think this is a great example of what happens when we really do have free access and free collaboration.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I'm as you're talking, Emily, I'm thinking back on all the community meetings I've covered as a journalist, and all the select board meetings and all the town meetings and that type of thing. And I have seen explosions happen when someone doesn't speak kindly or they say something hurtful, but they're never last as long as the problems that are created by people not talking at all.
Yeah. So the other big takeaway for me about all of this is, there's a campaign that's been going on for a long time around storytelling around reproductive rights. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's called Shout Your Abortion. A lot of that work was really sort of, the power of a lot of that work has been spearheaded by queer folks and folks of color for a very long time and sort of the power of the story. But it shocks me how there are still folks who don't understand like what this feels like and looks like on a day-to-day basis. And I think that really means that we do need to do a better job of telling our stories every day, like the hurt and the joy and just the experience of what it is to be in a certain body with certain rights. And so I'm going to stay committed to that as well.
Thank you, Emily. Leslie, what would you
If
like
I
to add?
may, I was really, taken by what Emily said. We had 32 witnesses and generally when in a floor report, you list every witness that comes, but Chair of our committee, Representative Hoden, did not do that. She says, I have the list, it's on the table. There was not one witness from the administration, 0. And we had, as I said earlier, the Attorney General and the members of the Office of Professional Regulation, the Assistant Secretary of State, hugely wonderful collaboration, pivoting really fast. As I say, this very last amendment was, the last minute, the last night before we presented the bill. And it was an honor to watch this work because it was so caring for people in our state. So as far as I'm concerned, the administration is absent. And then at the last minute, I heard that the commissioner of Vermont Department of Health was working hard to stockpile meds. I didn't know that. There was no real communication with us. So the absence of communication and collaboration is really unfortunate. But I'm proud of our legislature to be able to pivot and really listen to what's needed in this really real-time way, as Emily said. But it's really about leadership. We had leadership in our committee. We had leadership in the House. We had leadership in the Senate to do this. And I've heard through the grapevine that the governor's going to sign the bill. He could not sign the bill. That would be suicide in some ways. So this bill is going to be okay. And I'm really happy for that.
Thank you. We are out of time, unfortunately. Any last thoughts we want to leave listeners with before we head out for the week?
I would just really encourage folks to dive into these issues in your own community, have a conversation with a neighbor about your own reproductive story and your own reproductive history so that we're all, better informed and caring for each other. And take this incredible freedom that we've been granted in Vermont and go out and fight for someone else's.
Leslie?
Yeah, I'm thinking about pregnancy centers. If you hear something about them and you're worried about something, please contact me, contact Emily. Our contact information's on the legislative website. It really depends on what district you live in. So I'm not going to say contact your legislator because that may not be the supportive person you would wish. But I think that's a place where we need work. I think we need to really think about it from the lens of civil rights, that they're trying to take away civil rights of people who they have no business even being involved in their lives at all. So that's how I'm seeing it.
Thank you. And Leslie, remind us if people want to reach out to you, where can they find your contact info?
Go to the Vermont legislative website and just put in Leslie Goldman and you'll have my email address. Yeah, contact me by email and I answer all of them.
Wonderful. Emily, if people want to reach out to you.
Folks can go to emilykornheiser.org and you'll find links to my newsletter, social media, phone number, email, all those things. I am on like a 2 to 3 week delay on some of my email responses at this point in the session. So apologies for that.
If I may, I have a similar website. It's lesliegoldmanvt.com. Yeah. And then you can contact me that way too, which is a good way also.
Fantastic. Thank you. Well, the Montpelier Happy Hour on WBEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro will be back next week. In the meantime, you can also find us at our website, the montpelierhappyhour.captivate.fm, or you can send us an email at themontpelierhappyhour@gmail.com. Hey, everybody, take care and have a good weekend.